It was just another Friday evening. I had been working most of the day, running errands and trying to figure out what to do with my life, typical 20-something stuff, I guess. My name's Jean, I'm 25, and I live with my dad. I know, that might sound a little strange to some people, but it's not unusual around here. After my mom passed a few years ago, it just made sense for me to stay home with him. Besides, we've always been close, and the thought of leaving him all alone felt wrong. That night, everything started out pretty normal. Dad came home from work at the auto shop, smelling like motor oil, as usual. He works hard, and owning the shop has been both his dream and a nightmare at the same time. It keeps the bills paid, but it wears him down. I've always admired his dedication, even though I could see how tired it made him. As soon as he stepped through the door, I could tell he wasn't alone. His footsteps were accompanied by a second pair, slightly heavier, and I glanced up from my spot on the couch to see him walking with Joe. Now, Joe wasn't a stranger. I had seen him around plenty of times. He's one of Dad's best workers. Taller than Dad, with messy blonde hair and this laid-back energy that made him seem easygoing, even when things were tense at the shop. Joe was 28, not that much older than me, but still part of that world of cars and grease and engines that I never quite understood. He didn't talk much whenever he came over, usually just keeping to himself or chatting with Dad about work, but I noticed him. How could I not? "Hey, Jean," Dad called as they walked into the kitchen. "Hope you made something we can eat." "I'm starving." I rolled my eyes, smiling a little. "Yeah, I made pasta. It's not gourmet, but it's food." Joe gave me a nod as he followed Dad in, his hands shoved in his pockets. "Hey," he said, his voice low and casual, as always. He didn't say much more, but I caught the way his eyes lingered on me for a second longer than they usually did. It was subtle, but enough to make my stomach do a weird little flip. Dinner was uneventful, at least for the most part. Dad and Joe sat down at the table, discussing some problem with a customer's car. I half-listened as I ate, but my mind was elsewhere. Every so often, I'd glance over at Joe, catching him stealing glances at me when Dad wasn't paying attention. It was strange. He wasn't being obvious about it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in those looks. Something different. Maybe it was just in my head. Maybe I was overthinking it. But the more I noticed it, the more I felt this weird tension between us. Not uncomfortable exactly, but definitely new. After dinner, Dad cracked open a couple of beers, and he and Joe started talking about shop stuff again. I was half tempted to stay and eavesdrop, but I felt like I needed some space to think. So, I excused myself and went upstairs to take a shower. I let the hot water run over me, trying to relax, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Joe. There was something about the way he had been looking at me tonight. He'd always been polite and respectful, but this felt different. It was like there was something simmering under the surface, something unspoken. I hated how much I was thinking about him. I mean, he was just Joe, my dad's coworker, the guy who worked on cars all day. But for some reason, that tension between us had lodged itself in my brain, and I couldn't shake it. As I stood there, rinsing off the day, I started to wonder what it would be like if something did happen between us. Was that what he wanted? Or was I just imagining things? The idea of it made my stomach twist in a way that was both exciting and terrifying. I knew it would be complicated, messy even, but part of me couldn't help but wonder if it was worth the risk. After the shower, I threw on some old pajamas and crawled into bed, trying to push the thoughts of Joe out of my mind. I was too tired to deal with it, and besides, it wasn't like anything was going to happen. I needed to sleep and stop letting my imagination get the best of me. I don't know how long I had been asleep, but the next thing I knew, I was half awake, my eyes fluttering open to the sound of my bedroom door creaking. My heart jumped in my chest, and I froze. My room was dark except for the faint light coming in from the street outside. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming, but then I saw it, a shadow moving quietly into the room. My breath caught in my throat as the figure stepped closer to my bed, moving silently, almost cautiously. For a split second, I thought it was Dad, but then I recognized the outline. It was Joe. My heart pounded harder in my chest as I lay there, too shocked to move or speak. What was he doing in my room? I couldn't wrap my head around it. He was just standing there, close to the bed now, his breathing steady but controlled. I could feel the tension in the air, the way everything seemed to hang in the balance. I wanted to say something, to ask him what he was doing, but the words wouldn't come. I wasn't scared exactly, but I was definitely nervous. There was this strange, electric feeling between us, like we both knew something was about to happen but neither of us wanted to be the one to make the first move. Then, without warning, Joe reached out and brushed his hand against my arm. It was a light touch, almost hesitant, but it sent a jolt of warmth through me. My breath hitched, and I turned toward him, my body reacting before my mind could catch up. His eyes met mine in the dim light, and for a moment, we just stared at each other, neither of us saying a word. Then, slowly, he leaned down, his hand still resting on my arm, and his lips brushed against mine. The kiss was soft at first, tentative, like we were both testing the waters. But then it deepened, and all the confusion, the hesitation, disappeared. There was only the heat of the moment, the overwhelming rush of desire that neither of us could deny anymore. Before I knew it, I was pulling him closer, my hands tangling in his hair as the kiss grew more intense. Everything else faded away, the risks, the consequences, the fact that my dad was asleep just down the hall. None of it mattered in that moment. All I could think about was Joe, the way his hands felt on my skin, the way he made me feel alive in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. When I woke up the next morning, the sun was streaming through the window, casting a warm glow over the room. I blinked, trying to shake the sleep from my eyes, and for a moment, I wasn't sure if what had happened last night was real or just a dream. But then I felt the warmth of Joe's body next to mine, and I knew it wasn't a dream. He was still here, lying beside me, his breathing slow and steady as he slept. Reality hit me hard. What had we done? My mind was racing with 1,000 questions, but none of them had answers. Joe stirred beside me, his eyes fluttering open, and for a moment, we just looked at each other, both of us trying to process what had happened. "We should talk," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Joe nodded slowly, rubbing his eyes as he sat up. "Yeah, we should." But before either of us could say anything more, we heard footsteps in the hallway. "Dad." My heart sank, and Joe's eyes widened as we both scrambled to get out of bed. He quickly grabbed his clothes and slipped out the window, and I was left standing there, my heart pounding as I heard Dad knock on my door. The door creaked open just as I managed to pull my blanket over myself, pretending I had just woken up. My heart was still racing from the panic of Joe slipping out, and I prayed my dad wouldn't suspect anything. "Morning, kiddo," Dad said with a yawn as he stuck his head through the door. "You up?" I forced a smile, trying to look as normal as possible. "Yeah, just woke up," I replied, my voice still a little shaky. He nodded, leaning against the doorframe. "Thought I'd let you know I'm heading back to the shop. Got a lot of work to do today. You want anything while I'm out?" I shook my head, grateful that he didn't seem to notice how nervous I was. "No, I'm good. Thanks." With a wave, he was gone, the door closing softly behind him. I waited until I heard his footsteps retreating down the hall before I let out a long breath I didn't realize I was holding. My heart was still pounding in my chest, and I couldn't shake the feeling of guilt gnawing at me. What had I gotten myself into? I spent the rest of the morning in a weird daze, replaying the events of the night before in my mind. Part of me was still exhilarated by what had happened between Joe and me, but the other part, the more rational part, was terrified. This wasn't just some fling. This was my dad's coworker, someone he trusted and relied on. If Dad found out what had happened, what we were doing, it would destroy him. He'd never forgive us. But as much as I tried to convince myself to stop, I couldn't. I couldn't deny the way Joe made me feel. It was like something had awakened inside me, something I didn't even know was there. I wanted more, even though I knew it was wrong. The danger of it all just made it that much more intoxicating. Later that afternoon, I got a text from Joe. "Joe, we need to talk." I stared at my phone, my stomach doing flips. I wasn't sure if he was regretting what had happened or if he was feeling the same way I was, but I knew we couldn't avoid it forever. We had to figure out what this meant, what we were going to do. Joe and I agreed to meet at the old park just outside town. It was quiet there, especially during the day, and we knew no one would bother us. I got there early, sitting on one of the old swings, kicking my feet back and forth nervously as I waited. My heart was still racing, and I had no idea how this conversation was going to go. Was he going to end things before they even started? Would he say last night was a mistake? When Joe finally showed up, he looked just as nervous as I felt. He walked over slowly, hands in his pockets, his usual calm demeanor replaced with something more serious. He sat down on the swing next to me, and for a few moments, neither of us said anything. The silence between us felt heavy, like we were both too scared to say the wrong thing. Finally, Joe broke the silence. "Jean, about last night." I bit my lip, bracing myself for what was coming. "I didn't mean for that to happen," he said quietly. "But I can't stop thinking about it. About you." His words caught me off guard. I had expected him to say it was a mistake, that we needed to forget about it and move on, but this was something else entirely. "Me too," I admitted softly. "I don't know what to do, Joe. It's not just about us. It's my dad. If he finds out." Joe nodded, his jaw tight. "I know. That's why we have to be careful. I don't want to hurt him, Jean. He's been good to me. But I can't pretend like I don't have feelings for you." Hearing him say it out loud made my heart flutter, even though I knew this was a terrible idea. We were playing with fire, and deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before we got burned. "What are we going to do?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Joe looked at me, his blue eyes serious. "We keep it quiet, for now. We don't say anything. Not until we figure out how to handle this. I don't want to hurt your dad, but I can't just walk away from this. From you." I nodded, feeling the weight of what he was saying. We were going to have to be careful, really careful. As much as I wanted this, I knew the risks. One wrong move, and everything would come crashing down. The days that followed were a strange blur of stolen moments and secret glances. Joe and I continued to see each other, but only when we were sure my dad wouldn't be around. It was thrilling in a way, sneaking around behind his back, but it also made me feel sick with guilt. Every time I saw my dad, I felt like I was lying to him, betraying the trust we had always had. But I couldn't stop. I didn't want to stop. Joe and I were getting closer, both emotionally and physically. There was this intense connection between us that I couldn't explain. He made me feel alive, like I was finally stepping out of the shadow I had been living in since my mom died. For the first time in a long time, I felt like I was in control of my own life, even if that life was a tangled mess of secrets and lies. But it wasn't long before the pressure started to build. The more time Joe and I spent together, the harder it became to hide it. My dad wasn't stupid, he knew something was up. He had started to ask more questions, wondering where I was going, why I was acting so distant. It was only a matter of time before he figured it out. One night, after Joe had come over for dinner again, my dad pulled me aside. "Jean, you've been acting strange lately," he said, his voice laced with suspicion. "What's going on with you?" I swallowed hard, my heart pounding in my chest. "Nothing, Dad. I'm just tired, I guess." He didn't look convinced. "Is there something you're not telling me?" I felt a lump form in my throat. I wanted to tell him the truth, to come clean and explain everything, but I couldn't. Not yet. It would break his heart, and I wasn't ready for that. "I'm fine, Dad," I said, forcing a smile. "Really?" He nodded slowly, but I could tell he wasn't buying it. The tension between us was growing, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he started digging deeper. As if things weren't complicated enough, there was something else hanging over me. Something I hadn't told Joe, or anyone. A few months ago, I had stumbled across something on my dad's computer that I wasn't supposed to see. I had been looking for an old family photo when I found a folder hidden deep in his files. At first, I didn't think much of it, but when I opened it, my heart stopped. There were photos of my dad with another woman. They weren't just casual pictures either, they were intimate, private. I didn't recognize the woman, and I had no idea how long this had been going on, but the pictures were undeniable. My dad was seeing someone else, and it looked like it had been going on for a while. I hadn't said anything at the time. I didn't know how to bring it up. My dad had always been faithful to my mom, or at least I thought he had been. But these photos told a different story. Now, with everything going on between Joe and me, those photos were the last thing I needed to think about. But they were there, lurking in the back of my mind, a secret I was keeping just as much as the one I shared with Joe. I knew I couldn't keep it all bottled up forever. Sooner or later, everything was going to come out, the photos, my relationship with Joe, all of it. And when it did, I wasn't sure how we were going to survive the fallout. The following week, things between Joe and me grew even more complicated. Every time he came over, there was a thick tension in the air, like we were constantly on edge, waiting for something to happen. We'd steal quick glances, share fleeting touches when my dad wasn't looking, but it was getting harder to keep our secret under wraps. I knew that if this kept up, we wouldn't be able to hide it for much longer. One night, after a particularly stressful day at the shop, my dad and Joe came back to the house for a few beers. I sat with them at the table, trying to act normal, but I couldn't shake the nervousness bubbling inside me. Joe seemed tense too, barely making eye contact with me, and my dad, well, he wasn't saying much either. Halfway through the night, Dad stood up to grab another beer from the fridge. As soon as he left the room, Joe's eyes flicked to mine. There was a flash of something in them, something that told me he was feeling the same way I was. He wanted me, and I wanted him. But my dad was only a few feet away, and the risk was too great. Still, that didn't stop me from feeling the heat rise in my chest, the longing that had become all too familiar. When Dad came back, he sat down with a sigh and cracked open his beer. "Joe," he said suddenly, his voice cutting through the silence, "you've been acting weird lately." My heart skipped a beat, and I could see Joe tense up beside me. "What do you mean?" Joe asked, his voice calm but cautious. Dad shrugged, taking a sip of his drink. "I don't know, man. You're just off. Something going on with you?" Joe shot me a quick look, then shook his head. "Nah, just tired, I guess. It's been a long week." Dad didn't seem satisfied with that answer, but he let it go for now. I could tell, though, that his suspicion was growing. The cracks in our secret were starting to show, and it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down. The next few days were tense. My dad was watching me more closely than usual, asking questions that seemed innocent on the surface but felt like he was digging for something. He'd ask me where I was going, who I was with, and even though I'd answer him truthfully most of the time, I could see the doubt in his eyes. One evening, after Joe had left for the night, my dad sat me down in the living room. The TV was on in the background, but neither of us was paying attention to it. I could feel the weight of what he was about to say hanging in the air. "Jean," he started, his voice low and serious, "there's something going on with you. You've been acting different, and I can't figure out why." I shifted uncomfortably on the couch, my heart pounding in my chest. I could feel the walls closing in, and I knew I couldn't keep lying to him, but I wasn't ready to tell the truth either. "I'm fine, Dad," I said, trying to sound convincing. "I've just been tired, that's all." He narrowed his eyes at me, clearly not buying it. "This isn't just about being tired. Something's going on, and I need you to be honest with me. Is there someone in your life that I don't know about?" I felt my breath catch in my throat. He was getting closer to the truth, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep up the facade. "No, Dad. There's no one," I lied, hating myself for it. He studied me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Finally, he sighed and stood up, shaking his head. "I just want you to know, you can talk to me about anything. I don't want you hiding stuff from me. We're all we've got, Jean." His words hit me harder than I expected, and the guilt twisted in my gut like a knife. I wanted to tell him everything, but the thought of seeing the hurt and betrayal in his eyes was too much to bear. "I know, Dad," I whispered. "I'm not hiding anything. I promise." But even as I said it, I knew it wasn't true. As the days passed, I could feel the pressure building. Joe and I were still seeing each other, but it was becoming more difficult to hide. My dad was growing more suspicious, and I knew it wouldn't be long before he figured out what was going on. We had to tell him. It was the only way. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, Joe texted me. "Joe, we can't keep this up. We need to tell him." My heart skipped a beat. I knew he was right, but the thought of actually going through with it terrified me. Still, we couldn't keep sneaking around like this forever. It wasn't fair to my dad or to us. I texted back. I know. But how do we even start? Joe, we'll figure it out. We'll do it together. I lay in bed for hours, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with all the possible ways this could go wrong. I knew my dad wasn't going to take it well. He was protective of me, especially after losing my mom, and the thought of me being with someone he worked with, someone he trusted, was going to hit him hard. But it was time. We couldn't hide anymore. The next evening, Joe and I decided we'd tell my dad the truth. We couldn't keep lying, and as terrifying as it was, we knew we had to face the consequences. I texted Joe to come over after dinner, and we agreed we'd sit down with my dad and explain everything. When Joe arrived, I could see the tension in his face. He was nervous, just like I was. My dad, on the other hand, was in a good mood, completely unaware of the storm that was about to hit him. We all sat down in the living room, and for a moment, none of us said anything. The silence was thick, and I could feel my heart pounding in my chest. Finally, I took a deep breath and spoke. "Dad," I started, my voice shaky, "there's something we need to talk to you about." My dad's smile faded, and he looked at me with concern. "What's going on, Jean?" Joe shifted uncomfortably beside me, and I glanced at him, trying to find the courage to continue. "It's about Joe and me," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We've been seeing each other." For a moment, there was silence. My dad just stared at us, his face blank, like he couldn't process what I had just said. Then, slowly, his expression changed. His face hardened, and I could see the anger building in his eyes. "What?" he said, his voice low and dangerous. Joe stepped in, his voice calm but firm. "It just happened. We didn't plan this, but we care about each other." My dad's face turned red, and he stood up abruptly, knocking over the coffee table in the process. "You've been sneaking around behind my back?" "With him?" he shouted, pointing at Joe. I flinched at the anger in his voice. This was worse than I had imagined. "Dad, I'm sorry," I whispered, tears welling up in my eyes. "We didn't mean for this to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen?" he spat, his face twisted in fury. "You went behind my back, both of you. How could you do this to me?" Joe tried to speak up, but my dad wasn't listening. He was too hurt, too angry. I could see the betrayal in his eyes, and it broke my heart. This was exactly what I had been afraid of. "I trusted you," my dad shouted, his voice cracking with emotion. "I trusted both of you, and this is how you repay me?" I couldn't take it anymore. The guilt was too much. I stood up, tears streaming down my face. "Dad, I'm sorry," I whispered again. "I didn't mean to hurt you." But he wasn't hearing any of it. He stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him, leaving Joe and me standing there in the wreckage of our confession. The house was quiet after my dad left, the air thick with the weight of what had just happened. Joe stood beside me, his face pale, his hands shaking slightly. Neither of us knew what to say. We had known this would be hard, but seeing the look on my dad's face, the sheer anger and betrayal, it was worse than I had imagined. But there was something else. Something I hadn't told Joe, or anyone, for that matter. It was a secret I had been carrying for months now, and I knew that if my dad ever found out about it, things would only get worse. The photos. I hadn't meant to find them, but one day while using my dad's computer, I had stumbled across a folder hidden deep in his files. Inside were pictures, intimate pictures, of him with another woman. A woman I didn't recognize. They weren't just casual photos either. They were intimate in a way that left no doubt about what was happening between them. I had kept the secret to myself, not wanting to hurt him or bring up painful memories of my mom. But now, with everything falling apart, I realized that those photos might be the key to understanding why my dad was so angry. He wasn't just hurt by what I had done, he was hiding something of his own. I barely slept that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I replayed the look on my dad's face, the anger, the betrayal. I wanted to forget it, but I couldn't. It felt like everything I had feared had come crashing down on me all at once. When I finally dragged myself out of bed the next morning, the house was eerily quiet. My dad hadn't come back last night after he stormed out, and I wasn't sure when he would. I kept glancing at the clock, my stomach in knots, dreading the moment he'd walk through the door. Joe had texted me a few times, asking how I was doing, but I hadn't responded yet. I didn't know what to say. Everything felt too overwhelming, and I didn't know how to move forward from here. What was I supposed to do now? Sitting at the kitchen table, staring at the cold cup of coffee in front of me, my thoughts kept drifting back to those photos. The ones of my dad and that woman. I had kept that secret buried for months, but now, after last night, I wondered if it was time to bring it to light. Part of me felt like it would only make things worse, but another part of me wondered if it was the missing piece of the puzzle. Maybe my dad wasn't just angry about Joe and me, maybe he was projecting his own guilt, his own secrets, onto us. I debated with myself for hours, pacing around the house, my phone clutched tightly in my hand. I knew that if I confronted my dad with the photos, there would be no going back. It would tear apart whatever was left of our relationship. But the longer I kept the secret, the more suffocated I felt. Later that afternoon, Joe came by the house. I hadn't asked him to, but part of me was relieved to see him. I didn't want to face all of this alone. When I opened the door, his expression was tense, and he looked as drained as I felt. "Hey," he said quietly, stepping inside. "You okay?" I shrugged, not really knowing how to answer. "I don't know. I don't know." He reached out and pulled me into a hug, and for a moment, I let myself sink into the comfort of his arms. It felt good to have someone there, someone who understood what I was going through. But even as I held on to him, the weight of everything that had happened still hung over us like a cloud. "We'll figure this out," Joe said softly, pulling back just enough to look me in the eye. "I know it's a mess right now, but we'll get through it." I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that this was bigger than either of us. My dad's anger wasn't just about us, it was about something deeper. Something he was hiding. "I found something," I said suddenly, my voice barely above a whisper. Joe frowned, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What do you mean?" I swallowed hard, knowing that once I said it out loud, there would be no turning back. "A few months ago, I found these photos on my dad's computer. Of him and another woman." Joe's eyes widened in surprise. "What? You're serious?" I nodded, feeling the weight of the secret settle heavily in the room. I didn't know what to do, so I didn't say anything. But now, after everything that's happened, I think that might be part of why he's so angry. He's hiding something too. Joe was silent for a moment, processing what I had just told him. Finally, he let out a long breath and ran a hand through his hair. "Jean, that's huge. You think he's having an affair?" "I don't know," I admitted. "But the photos are pretty intimate. I don't know how long it's been going on, or if it's still happening, but it's definitely something." Joe looked at me, his expression serious. "Do you think you should confront him about it?" The question hung in the air between us, heavy with uncertainty. I didn't know what the right answer was. Part of me wanted to lay it all out on the table, but another part of me was terrified of what would happen if I did. "I don't know," I said finally. "But I can't keep pretending everything's okay when it's not." Later that evening, my dad finally came home. I had been sitting on the couch, anxiously waiting for him, my mind racing with everything I wanted to say but didn't know how to. When I heard the front door open, my heart jumped in my chest. He walked in quietly, not saying a word, and for a moment, we just looked at each other. The anger from the night before had faded, replaced by something else, something more resigned. "I'm sorry, Dad," I whispered, breaking the silence. He sighed and sat down in the chair across from me, rubbing his temples like he had a headache. "It's not just about you and Joe," he said finally, his voice tired. "It's everything. This isn't how things were supposed to go, Jean." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I forced myself to keep going. "Dad, there's something I need to talk to you about. Something I found." He frowned, looking confused. "What are you talking about?" I took a deep breath, gathering my courage. "A few months ago, I was looking for something on your computer, and I found some photos." The color drained from his face, and I knew immediately that he understood what I was talking about. His eyes darkened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to get up and leave again. But he didn't. "What photos?" he asked, his voice low and guarded. I swallowed hard. "Photos of you and another woman." I didn't know how to bring it up, so I didn't say anything. But now, after everything that's happened, I think we need to talk about it. There was a long, heavy silence as my dad stared at me, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he shook his head. "It's not what you think." "Then what is it?" I asked, feeling the frustration bubble up inside me. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks pretty bad." He let out a long sigh, leaning back in his chair. "Jean, there are things you don't understand. I didn't want to tell you because I didn't want to hurt you, but, yes, there's someone else. It's been going on for a while." Hearing him say it out loud made my chest tighten. I had suspected it for months, but actually hearing him admit it felt like a punch to the gut. "Why didn't you tell me?" I whispered, my voice shaking. "I didn't want to drag you into it," he said quietly. "After your mom died, I wasn't sure how to handle things. I was lonely. It wasn't supposed to happen, but it did." I felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over me. I didn't know what to say. How was I supposed to process this? My dad, the man I had always looked up to, had been keeping the secret from me for who knows how long. And now, everything was falling apart. "I'm sorry, Jean," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "I know I should have told you, but I didn't want to hurt you. I didn't want you to see me like this." For a moment, I just sat there, trying to wrap my head around everything. The photos, Joe, my dad's affair, it was all too much. I felt like my entire world was crumbling around me, and I didn't know how to hold it all together. "I don't know what to say," I whispered finally. "I don't expect you to understand," my dad said softly. "But I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything." The days that followed were a blur of confusion and emotional exhaustion. My dad and I barely spoke, and when we did, it was awkward and strained. We both knew that our relationship had changed, things weren't the same anymore. The trust that had once been there had been shattered, and I didn't know if it would ever be repaired. Joe tried to be there for me, but even our relationship felt different now. The thrill of sneaking around had been replaced by the reality of the situation, and I wasn't sure how to navigate it anymore. We had wanted this, but now that we had it, it felt like everything else had fallen apart. One night, as we sat together in my room, Joe reached out and took my hand. "Do you think we can get through this?" he asked quietly. I looked at him, my heart heavy with uncertainty. "I don't know," I admitted. "But I want to try." Joe nodded, squeezing my hand. "Me too." The weeks that followed were tough. My dad and I were both trying to figure out how to move forward, how to repair the damage that had been done. It wasn't easy, and there were a lot of difficult conversations, a lot of moments where we both wanted to give up. But slowly, we started to heal. My dad ended things with the woman he had been seeing, and though it was painful, it was a step toward rebuilding the trust between us. It wasn't going to be easy, and I knew it would take time, but we were both committed to making things right. As for Joe and me, we decided to take things slow. The whirlwind of our secret relationship had left both of us a little shaken, and we needed time to figure out what we really wanted. It wasn't going to be perfect, but we were willing to put in the effort to make it work. After the night everything came out in the open, the house felt different. The tension that had been building for weeks was no longer lingering in the air, but it was replaced with something more hollow, like the aftermath of a storm that left everything in disarray. Dad and I tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, but it wasn't the same. The conversation we had about his affair was like an open wound between us, one that hadn't yet started to heal. He didn't talk about it much, and neither did I, but it was always there, hovering over our heads. Every time I looked at him, I was reminded of the fact that the man I thought I knew had kept something so significant from me. But we were trying. That's what mattered, I guess. We'd have these awkward little conversations about work or the weather, both of us pretending like things were okay, even though they weren't. Some days it felt like we were making progress, and other days it felt like we were stuck in this endless loop of unresolved tension. It was exhausting. But I knew things couldn't go back to the way they were before. We both had to accept that the relationship between us had changed, maybe permanently. The only way forward was to acknowledge that and figure out how to rebuild, slowly, and with a lot of time. Joe and I continued to see each other, but it was different now. After the secret had come out, the thrill of sneaking around was gone, replaced by the reality of what our relationship really meant. I cared about him, that much was true, but there was this nagging feeling in the back of my mind that wouldn't go away. Was this what I really wanted? I couldn't shake the guilt that still hung over me from the way things had played out with my dad. Joe and I had gone behind his back, and even though we had finally told him the truth, I knew I had broken something in my relationship with my father that couldn't easily be fixed. It didn't help that Joe and my dad were still working together every day at the shop. From what Joe told me, things were tense between them, but my dad hadn't fired him or anything. Still, there was this unspoken strain between them now, one that I could feel even when I wasn't around. "I don't know how much longer I can keep doing this," Joe said one night as we sat on the couch together. He wasn't talking about our relationship necessarily, but about the tension at the shop. "Your dad barely talks to me. It's like he's just waiting for me to mess up so he can get rid of me." I frowned, feeling a pit in my stomach. "Do you think he'll fire you?" Joe shrugged. "I don't know. He hasn't said anything, but it's like, I can feel it, you know? Things aren't the same. They can't be, after everything." I didn't know what to say. I could sense that Joe was as conflicted as I was. There were moments when everything felt right between us, but then there were times when it felt like we were both trying to hold on to something that wasn't meant to last. "I wish I knew how to fix this," I said quietly, resting my head on his shoulder. Joe sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Maybe there isn't a way to fix it. Maybe we just need time." But time wasn't something we had much of. Every day that passed, the pressure between Joe and my dad grew more intense, and I could feel the distance growing between Joe and me too. We were both caught in this tangled web of emotions, and I didn't know how to untangle myself from it. One afternoon, about a month after the big confrontation, Dad surprised me. We hadn't talked about anything deep in a while, just surface-level stuff, like what groceries to pick up or what time he'd be home from work. But that day, he came into the kitchen while I was making lunch and sat down at the table, his face more serious than I'd seen it in a while. "I've been thinking, Jean," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I turned to face him, setting down the knife I'd been using to chop vegetables. "About what?" "About us. About how things have been between us lately." He paused, rubbing his hands together like he was working up the nerve to keep going. "I know I screwed up. With your mom, with the affair. I should have been honest with you from the start. You deserved to know the truth." I felt a lump form in my throat, but I stayed quiet, letting him talk. "I don't expect things to go back to normal, but I want you to know that I'm sorry. For everything. For keeping that from you, and for how I reacted when I found out about you and Joe. I was hurt, but I didn't handle it well." I swallowed hard, blinking back tears. Hearing him say those words made something shift inside me. I had been so focused on my own hurt and betrayal that I hadn't really stopped to think about how he was feeling, too. He had lost my mom, just like I had, and he had been struggling in his own way. "I'm sorry too, Dad," I said, my voice shaky. "I shouldn't have kept things from you. I should have been honest about Joe." He nodded slowly. I know you care about him, and I get that. But it's hard for me, Jean. He's like family at the shop, and it's just complicated. I know it is, I said softly. We sat there for a few moments in silence, both of us trying to process everything. It wasn't some big, emotional breakthrough, but it was a step in the right direction. For the first time in weeks, I felt like we were both starting to heal. As much as I wanted to believe things were getting better, the reality of the situation with Joe and my dad was becoming harder to ignore. Joe had been right, things between him and my dad weren't improving. In fact, they were getting worse. One afternoon, Joe came over after work, his face tense and his hands clenched into fists. I knew immediately that something had happened. "What's wrong?" I asked, my stomach dropping as I watched him pace the living room. "Your dad," he muttered, shaking his head. "He blew up at me today at the shop. Said he doesn't know if he can keep me around anymore." I felt a chill run down my spine. "What? Why?" Joe stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression filled with frustration. "Because of us." He didn't come right out and say it, but it's obvious. Every time I make the smallest mistake, he jumps down my throat. I'm not sure how much longer I can take it, Jean. I bit my lip, feeling torn. I knew my dad was still upset about everything, but I hadn't realized it had gotten this bad. "What are you going to do?" Joe sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know. I can't keep working there if things are going to be like this. But I don't want to leave either. I need the job, and I care about your dad. I don't want to make things worse for you." I felt my chest tighten with anxiety. This was exactly what I had been afraid of. Joe's job at the shop was important to him, but now, because of me, he was on the verge of losing it. And my relationship with my dad, which had finally started to heal, was hanging in the balance. "I don't know what to do, Joe," I whispered, my voice breaking. "I don't want to lose you, but I don't want things with my dad to fall apart again." Joe walked over and pulled me into his arms, holding me tightly. "We'll figure it out," he said softly, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. But as much as I wanted to believe him, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were reaching a breaking point. The tension between Joe and my dad was too much, and I wasn't sure how we were going to make it through this. Over the next few days, the situation at the shop continued to worsen. Joe's frustration grew, and my dad's coldness toward him became impossible to ignore. Every time Joe came over, he was more tense, more on edge, and I could feel the distance growing between us. One night, as we sat in the living room together, Joe finally broke down. "I can't do this anymore, Jean," he said, his voice filled with frustration and sadness. "Your dad, he's not going to let this go. No matter how much we try, he's always going to be angry about us." I looked at him, my heart breaking. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I think we need to take a step back. Maybe I need to leave the shop. Maybe I need to get away from this." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. "Leave? You mean leave me?" "No, I don't want to leave you," Joe said quickly. "But I think I need to distance myself from your dad. It's not working anymore. And if I stay, I'm afraid it's only going to make things worse between us." I felt tears prick at the corners of my eyes. I didn't want to lose him, but I could see the strain this was putting on him. And as much as I hated to admit it, maybe he was right. Maybe the only way for us to heal, for all of us to heal, was to put some space between Joe and my dad. "I don't want you to go," I whispered, my voice trembling. Joe pulled me into his arms, holding me close. "I don't want to go either. But I think it's the only way to make things right." A week later, Joe quit the shop. It wasn't some big, dramatic exit. He didn't want to cause any more trouble for my dad, so he left quietly, without much fanfare. But I knew how much it hurt him. Working at the shop had been important to Joe. It had given him a sense of purpose, a connection to something bigger than himself. Leaving it behind wasn't easy, but he did it, for me, for us. My dad didn't say much when Joe left. I think he knew that it was for the best, but there was still this lingering tension between us. We were healing, yes, but it wasn't going to be a quick fix. The wounds we had inflicted on each other ran deep, and they weren't going to close overnight. Joe and I stayed together, but things were different now. We had been through so much, and the weight of everything that had happened still hung over us. But we were trying. That was what mattered. Months passed, and life slowly began to settle into a new rhythm. Joe found a new job at another auto shop across town, and while things between him and my dad were still strained, they weren't as volatile as they had been before. We were all learning to coexist in the aftermath of everything that had happened, trying to rebuild the trust and relationships that had been damaged. It wasn't easy, and there were still moments of tension, but I could see progress. My dad and I were slowly starting to reconnect, talking more openly about everything that had happened, the affair, my relationship with Joe, all of it. It was painful, but necessary. As for Joe and me, we were taking things slow. We didn't want to rush into anything, knowing that we both still had healing to do. But we were committed to each other, and that was enough for now. In the end, I realized that relationships, whether with family, friends, or romantic partners, are messy. They're complicated and filled with ups and downs, but they're also worth fighting for. The road to healing wasn't a straight line, but we were all walking it together, one step at a time. And for now, that was enough.